Hey, nerds. So, going to continue my series on Michel Foucault's book called History of Sexuality. As you know, many of you know, Michel Foucault is my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher, and he did deconstruction along with Derrida, who was another so-called post-structuralist, even though they disagreed a lot. And Foucault mostly talked about culture and history, while Derrida he wrote more about culture and language specifically, but they also, of course, examined many other areas. And History of Sexuality is basically about the history of how culture has changed in terms of sex and the power of modern institutions like religion or the church, government, and science. And basically, particularly in Europe from the 1600s through the 1800s through the Enlightenment period of history. And so, yeah, let's get into the paragraph here. He's talking about basically sexuality and blood in terms of race and how these are used through the power of the state in terms of Nazis as his example. So remember, he's not a fucking Marxist. He's an anti-statist most of the time. Like, he sounds more like an anarchist than anything else, contrary to what Jordan Peterson says. No, Foucault is not a fucking Marxist, and neither was Derrida. They both disagreed, and neither of them were Marxists. They wrote about Marx, but they were not Marxists. They thought he had good opinions and bad opinions, like most philosophers. Duh. Anyway, let's get into the paragraph. Okay. Well, it is true that the analytics of sexuality and the symbolics of blood were grounded at first in two very distinct regimes of power. In actual fact, the passage from one to the other did not come about any more than did these powers themselves, without overlappings, interactions, and echoes. Okay, so the analytics of sexuality and the symbolics of blood, like the symbolics of blood, pure blood, like you're of the pure race, that sort of thing, right? So the analytics of sexuality and the symbolics of blood, they were at first contained within two separate regimes of power, but of course there are always overlaps, interactions, and echoes within these two separate realms of power. So the realms of power in terms of racial purity and sexual purity, those types of power overlap, interact, and echo sometimes. So, you know, the way that the government uses their power to control, even leading to like eugenics in terms of Hitler, like we've talked about before, to control the blood, to keep people's blood all pure, right? And to keep the blood pure by preventing these sexually impure people from having sex with these sexually pure people over here, right? Okay, so in different ways, the preoccupation with blood and the law has for nearly 2 centuries haunted the administration of sexuality. So the preoccupation with blood and the law, basically the preoccupation with purity of blood and the law, so using the state as ways to use the state as a way to create laws to maintain the racial purity of the blood in the population, as many totalitarian governments and like Hitler, or even just any, like I think he's also talking about just any government during the Enlightenment period, not even necessarily a quote unquote totalitarian one, right? So it haunted the administration of sexuality, blood, and the law. So two of these interferences are noteworthy, the one for its historical importance, the other for the problems it poses. The preoccupation with blood, the historical importance of the preoccupation with the purity of blood, and the problems that the purity of blood and sexuality poses for the Enlightenment. So, beginning in the second half of the 19th century, so like after the 1850s, the thematics of blood was sometimes called on to lend its entire historical weight toward revitalizing the type of political power that was exercised through the devices of sexuality. So after the 1850s, these what he later refers to as like the blood myth, like this myth of pure blood, um, was you was used to reshape political power, and then the political power was exercised through the devices of sexuality. So the government literally controls the breeding population, so you control the populace's sexuality through the power of the government in order to maintain the power of the supposedly pure blood, right? Okay, so racism took shape at this point. Racism in its modern biologizing status form, because racism wasn't always the same. Like it was more based on, if you go back farther in human history, depending on what period of history and what part of the world you're in, like in ancient Rome or Greece, for example, the racism was more like cultural, or like it wasn't based on skin color. It's like that guy's a Gaul, that guy's a whatever, like like race based on where you're from, not based on skin color. But so a more like quote unquote biological way of looking at it, right? The modern biologizing status form, racism as a form of the government exercising the power over people's sexuality in order to supposedly maintain the pure blood of the noble Nazi race or whatever, right? So racism took shape at this point, racism in its modern biologizing statist form. It was then that whole politics of settlement, family, marriage, education, social hierarchization, and property, accompanied by a long series of permanent interventions at the level of the body, conduct, health, and everyday life, received their color and their justification from the mythical concern with protecting the purity of the blood and ensuring the triumph of the race. Exactly, right? So racism exercised through the power of the state through the methods of controlling people's sexuality in order to maintain the supposed pure blood of the race. And then it gets into this, like, basically this Enlightenment hierarchy that we have starting somewhere around the 1850s of, this cultural idea, I guess you could say, of family. You need to have family, get married, educate yourself with a post-secondary education, fit into the social hierarchy, and own property. In order for everyone to do this and fit into our nice little roles in society, the government permanently interferes in the realm of the body, conduct, health, and everyday life. And people obey this due to their mythical concern of protecting the purity of blood and then protecting the triumph of the noble race, right? So, Nazism was doubtless the most cunning and most naive, and the former because of the latter combination of the fantasies of blood and the paroxysms of disciplinary power. That's good. So, Nazism was the most cunning because it was the most naive, and it was the most cunning, and because it was the most naive, fantasy of blood and paroxysm of disciplinary power. So, it was cunning due to its naive combination of blood fantasies and paroxysms of disciplinary power. A eugenic ordering of society, with all that implied in the way of extension and intensification of micropowers in the guise of an unrestricted state control, was accompanied by the Wuneric, I should have looked up that word, Wuneric exaltation of a superior blood. The latter implied both the systematic genocide of others and the risk of exposing oneself to a total sacrifice. The Nazi eugenics regime and genocide of Jews and plenty of other types of people, right? It is an irony of history that, actually, I should go over that again. So, eugenic ordering society, intensification of micropowers, unrestricted state control of people's sexuality, controlling sexuality so you can maintain the purity of the blood and maintain the pure Nazi race, that sort of thing, right? Superior blood, implying genocide of the Jews. It is an irony of history that the Hitlerite politics of sex remained an insignificant practice while the blood myth was transformed into the greatest bloodbath in recent memory. That's so well written there. Hitlerite politics of sex remained an insignificant practice. So, like the Nazi regime of, having only pure sex or stuff, or something like that, was very much secondary to the blood myth. The blood myth, like this very strong notion in Nazis' heads of, or not all of them necessarily, but the ones who actually had those ideological beliefs, they had such a strong belief in the myth of pure blood that, as we know, it led to the Holocaust, the greatest bloodbath in recent history. I mean, I think obviously, like, Stalin and Mao killed more people, but this is I would say, the most iconic bloodbath in recent memory, and the most horrifying that people think about, because we're talking about concentration camps, millions of people. Historians have highlighted this more, and that's why it's in our memory. And it's still at least by far, one of the greatest bloodbaths in recent memory. So yes, as Foucault is brilliantly pointing out here, I think, the power of the state is engineered through the state controlling people's sexuality and breeding, literally, in order to maintain the blood myth of the pure, superior Nazi race.